You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
A lot of listeners out there know I have a good passion for arguing the importance of the Fourth Estate. Now, I say a good passion because it hasn't got me in trouble yet. But I believe that the media is important to understanding how a nation sees and perceives some of our most important issues. This show's about war, and what could be more important than the expenditure of national blood and treasure for national objectives? It's also important to understand about the wars we don't know. We need an active media to go out there and cover these wars. Do we always have them? And how do people get interested in being that Fourth Estate representative that will travel to these backwaters and let us know what the story is? G'day listeners, you're listening to Mick from The Dead Prussian, the only podcast hosted by an Australian named after a Prussian military theorist of the 19th century. A very, very niche podcast, but one you all love. So if you do love us, make sure you jump online, support us on Facebook and Twitter, and you also take a look at the merchandise. It is not high-priced, it is not overpriced, it's accurately priced. Now, my guest today is going to talk with me a little bit about what it's like to be a foreign correspondent in some of the worst places, in some of the worst times. Now, interestingly, reading his book, I realised that it's not necessarily about the worst places, it's just more about the worst times. And those of you that have visited some of these conflict-ridden countries will understand what I mean. And the rest of you are probably just a little bit too obtuse. My guest today is Hugh Riminton. Hugh is a 40-year veteran of the news game, a career which has included quite a bit of time as a foreign correspondent, covering the conflicts many of us have seen on the telly, read about in the newspapers, studied, or in fact, for some of you, served in. He is currently the news anchor for Channel 10's Eyewitness News in Sydney, and that's a city in Australia. Some of you may have heard of it. And he's also a director of the philanthropic organisation Soldier On Australia. And you all know I'm a big fan of the work they do. Now, this is a short and unjust bio for one of my personal heroes of the Fourth Estate. Luckily, he's just released his autobiography, Minefields. I've just given it a read, listeners, and I'd be really, really happy if you could give it a read as well, after you listen to this show, of course. It's a cracking yarn. Hugh, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to see you, Mick.
Now, Hugh, before we discuss your time covering some of the worst war has to offer, I'm interested to understand how you got into the news game in general, and more particularly, how you then ended up travelling around the world as a foreign correspondent.
Yes, so at the risk of sounding like this is a confessional, I was a bit of a lost teenager. Mm-hmm. I was growing up in Christchurch in New Zealand and at a big boys' state school, and I was basically drunk most of the time. I was drinking before going to school in the morning, and it wasn't doing much for my grades or my reputation among the teachers. And you know, I slipped easily into the career path of someone with that sort of schooling, and somehow I'd just got enough points to go to university, mm-hmm. So I had that in the back pocket, but I took up a job as a hospital cleaner, which I wasn't very good at, so I got busted down to actually, within this hospital, they had an animal laboratory where they did all kinds of medical experiments, chiefly on rats. There were a few rabbits and a sheep, solitary sheep, and my job was to clean the rat cages of all the things that make a mess in a rat cage. So I was a rat poo cleaner, and by chance I met a radio news director who by further chance mistook me for someone who was applying for a job. So he started interviewing me as a job applicant. It was immediately apparent to me that that's what he was doing, because he asked me, why do you want to be in journalism? And I managed to just stifle the instinct to say, I've got no idea what you're talking about, and I've never occurred to me to be a journalist. But I was cleaning rat poo cages, right? So so I said, because it would be fun. And he gave me a bit of back and forth on that, but hired me. And so at 17, I was relieved from rat poo duties and became a cadet reporter for much less pay.
But better working conditions, I imagine.
Marginally.
And at the time, did you see yourself as that young journalist cadet in the future being in conflict zones?
No, I don't think so at all. I think I was interested initially at the thought that perhaps through journalism, I might get an understanding as to how the world worked. And that intrigued me. I was curious about everything, about how the world works, even down to how a city operates, who makes decisions, what is crime, where does it come from? Even sporting heroes, get to interview sports heroes, and so whatever it was, I was interested in the thought that you could start to learn about stuff, and then a little light did go off in my head where I thought that it was conceivable, because travelling in those days was much more expensive in relative terms than it is now. It was conceivable that somehow or other I might be able to get someone to pay me to travel, and of course, being a young, relatively fit guy, adventure travel was what interested me. So becoming a foreign correspondent was really a desire to come out of two things, really. A desire to understand how the world worked, but also to travel in an adventurous way. And I was lucky to get all of that.
Wow. It's interesting, the understanding how a city works, the ecosystem, more or less, of what you can learn reporting on it. It's very interesting. You talked about crime. As I like to tell people, I'm a criminologist, but non-practicing at the moment. There's a lot of parallels with what we talk about in this show, the phenomenon of war and the construct of human-on-human conflict. So I'm interested to know a little bit more about your initial beginnings reporting from war zones. So how did you find yourself covering your first conflict that you travelled to?
So I don't know if it counts as a conflict, but in 1987 I was working as a radio journalist for 3AW, part of the Macquarie network, which is quite a powerful network in Melbourne. And I happened to be in the office when the first Fiji coup happened. The boss suddenly looks up and says, there is a flight out of here at 1 o'clock. Has anyone got a passport? And I was able to make that plane for no other reason than because I lived closest to work and could pick up a passport. So on the way to the airport. So my first foreign adventure, if you like, as a reporter was one of those breaks that comes through pure random luck. It could have been anyone else in that newsroom. And that was the first time I was flown into a place where you saw soldiers masked up, with their faces covered with black balaclavas, carrying around their M16s, and having taken over a parliament, having taken over the instruments of the media, the newspapers, the radio stations. There was no TV in Fiji at the time, and taking over a country. And it wasn't completely benign. Some people wrote about it as being the holiday coup, but it wasn't quite like that. There were two Australian journalists were twice subjected to mock executions, marched out, and they thought one of them was Peter Cave, a long-time ABC giant who became the foreign international editor, and the other one was Red Harrison, who was a very seasoned BBC and ABC correspondent. So, and I was thrown in jail in the course of this, a couple of times put into cells. There were mobs running through the street. It was quite an intense time, and it was my first insight, not into war per se, but into what happens when a democratic system in an instant breaks down and you have soldiers in the street and all the rules at that point are broken and open to be remade.
It's an interesting coup. I actually learnt more about the Fiji coup going through with Rabuka's nephew through the Royal Military College. We trained to be lieutenants together. So when reading about it in your book, I learnt quite a bit about how that coup, having been labelled the holiday coup, actually played out. And then as I got further in your book, I was like, you started off covering this tropical paradise amidst turmoil, and then you started finishing your time covering multiple conflicts in Africa. And in your book, you write quite a bit about your time there. And for those people that haven't been to Africa, I urge you to go. It's, especially Australians, you'll find something both alien and familiar about the place. So you also ended up covering quite a bit in the Middle East and Central Asia. So we travel from a holiday destination where a lot of Aussies tend to go, and then you go to places where a lot of Aussies definitely do not travel to. The African conflicts really interest me. How do the conflicts in Africa compare to those you've covered in the Middle East and also some of the ones in Europe?
So I got sent. I went into television out of Melbourne and very raw. I got the posting of the London correspondent for Channel 9, which is a great gig. And the area of operations, if you want to call it that, basically run from Cape Town to Russia to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Most stories traditionally have been across Europe, but as it happened, my period there coincided with what I call the township wars going on in South Africa in the period between Mandela being released from jail and the election in 1994. So that was these are pretty intense times. There were a lot of journalists actually getting killed, and I narrowly avoided getting necklaced, which is a particularly unpleasant township way of killing people. But I also had my first of many experiences of actually being in the field with Australian troops in Somalia. So I was one of those. They didn't call them embeds in those days, but I was one of those in Operation Ops Solace.
Yep.
And that was a really interesting first experience of just sort of sharing a tent and a space with the diggers on a difficult mission. If not strictly a war, it wasn't a war fighting mission as such, but confronting for a lot of the people who were there on a whole bunch of levels. And then I covered I did my best to cover the Rwandan genocide in 94, and I was back there again in 95 when the Kabayo massacre happened.
Yeah.
And I've stayed in contact with some of those Kabayo survivors, and their experience from that has been an absolutely scarring, life-changing event for so many of them. And then I kept on going back to Africa because the stories are just so enormous. The lines of communication are so long. The myriad ways in which you can get yourself into trouble, that you can't really protect against.
Yeah.
There's a great Hemingway line: to live in Africa, you've got to be willing to die in Africa. Yeah. And I think that's right. If you're worried about your own capacity to survive, you are so alert and alarmed to so many potential threats that you cannot actually really function. You have to essentially go through that little invisible wall and say, I will take whatever this experience is, whatever comes. And if you're willing to take on all the dangers and the threats and the sheer randomness of strange things, then you can immerse yourself in that experience, and they are life-changing experiences. So some of them, more than anything, I think, were the ones in Sudan.
Yeah.
In the middle of a really horrible civil war, blunt instruments of famine.
Yeah.
The slave trade,
Yeah.
which resumed buying slaves as part of a story to prove the slave trade existed.
Yeah.
These are just amazing experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting listening and reading in your book about how you covered the different conflicts that you went to as a foreign correspondent, and I found it interesting how you freewheeled on battlefields around Africa and the Middle East, and I use the term battlefields quite broadly in this sense, conflict zones. There's many of us who've spent time in these countries. I know personally most of these countries I've been to, I've been very adequately prepared for my own personal protection. But you've freewheeled on battlefields, but you've also been embedded with teams, as a journalist, with militaries from both the US and Australia. I'm interested to know, how does the coverage and the ability to capture the stories differ between being someone freewheeling around Baghdad as part of the CNN team versus being embedded with Captain Nick Perryman and his team in Cop Mashal?
Yeah, so I've had my experiences, say, with the Australian Defence Force. There was Somalia, there was East Timor, there was Ramsey and Solomon Islands. I saw them in small numbers. I saw them in a whole variety of other little places around the place. In Iraq, not so much, because they were not really where I was. In Afghanistan, I was embedded in there as well. So my experiences, I've always felt to be useful. It's great to get insights into what Aussie diggers, and most of the time you're with Army. A few things with Navy and a couple of times with the Air Force. But basically it's Army that you're exposed to, and I have a great respect for the Australian, frontline diggers. Just their character, I like them. I don't want to overly sentimentalise them in a sense. I don't think that does them any great value either. But that was interesting. But the actual controls that are placed on your capacity to report, particularly as you get more sophisticated about your understanding of the conflict zones themselves, are frustrating when you go with the Australians. And you have, I would say, none of those frustrations. Effectively, you do have none of those frustrations if you're with the Americans. So I went off and worked for CNN for a time, and I worked out of their offices, their bunker, effectively in Baghdad. Not in the green zone; it was out in the red zone with its own blast walls, machine guns on the nest, nest on the roof, and we would go out. Not all our stories were with the military. We did all kinds of stuff in the community with our own security and so on. But when we went out with the military, which we did a fair bit, there was no public affairs officer looking over your shoulder. There was no one vetting your stuff for OPSEC. You went out with the privates and the sergeants, and if they got blown up or shot up, you were in there getting blown up and shot up with them. And quite often, the lieutenant colonel or whatever would want to come along with you. He's going to see an opportunity to see a CNN crew. He wants it to be seen that he's doing great things.
Yeah.
So he'd sometimes get these guys wanting to make a point of taking you around somewhere or showing something off to you. And in fact, you get generals would contact you and say, I'm going to lay on a helicopter, or the colonel, the aide de camp, whatever. The general wants to show you around some district, or to take you off to lunch, as happened, which was interesting part of the reporting. But the bit which I always really enjoyed was just going out and seeing what the soldiers on the ground were seeing. And we had some narrow squeaks, but no one cared about it. CNN accepted. They did what they could to protect you, but they accepted the very real risk that their people might get wounded or killed in action, and they lost people in Iraq. And that's a great liberating force when you have a boss who's so desperate to save you from harm that you can't actually do your job. And it's the same with the US military. They didn't care. And if you wanted to go down and interview a private, build a story around a young NCO, you can do it. No one cares. So that was immeasurably better generally than the Australian experience, which over worries about it. Having said that, my experiences in Afghanistan, I had tremendous support from now Admiral David Johnson, from Major General, as then was John Cantwell. I think also have to say there's probably a nod from Angus Houston, who was then the CDF. And from the people who were down on the ground, they were fantastic. We got to the places we wanted to go to. We were under fire with Australian troops up in the Baluchi Valley. We were able to report on and see how they were living, what they were trying to do, and live that, if only for a short period, with them.
It's a strange sort of way of looking at it. A lot of people, particularly in Australia, see Australia and the US as almost completely interoperable, but we've still got to remember the differences in those cultural issues. And I think Australians tend to be a lot more cautious in our approach to certain things, whereas the Americans uphold their freedom of speech rights.
That's so critical. And that was what brought it really home to me. We got out of one particular messy ambush and came to a safe place. This was in West Baghdad in 2007 when the surge was running. And I went to interview the sergeant who'd led this patrol, 24-year-old sergeant. And I thought I didn't know what he was going to say. And a couple of Democrats had basically started to say out loud, senior Democrats saying it's a civil war, we shouldn't be there, we should be winding our way out. So I just put that idea to him. And he gave me a really clear analysis, essentially, of the war, the state of the war, which he agreed it was a civil war. And he said that, the United States had effectively brought it on, and that when the United States and the coalition pulled out, that it was the people who had supported the US effort who would suffer the most, and the ones who had opposed it who would be the victors in that system. He said, I think we're going to leave this country worse than we found it. And this was from a 24-year-old sergeant who was confident enough in his constitutional First Amendment rights to free speech to be able to say that. And to the best of my knowledge, suffered no adverse effects for saying that. For CNN, it went right across the United States, was seen by every general, Joint Chiefs of Staffs, but it was the unvarnished sense of the war from a digger on the ground. And the freedoms of that, the benefits of that, far outweigh the controlling the message type of thing. I think Australians still they've struggled with it internally in the ADF, I know that. but I still think their instinct is to control more than they need to.
Excuse me for a sec. All right. I'm not contagious.
I knew I shouldn't have been wearing my VX aftershave. It works on some people.
No, it's been an important day for you. You need to smell the best you can. Now, the information landscape is something you and I have had a chat before on Twitter about, and how it's changed. And you've worked for Australian networks, you've worked for CNN, you've broadcast. I think one of the first Western media outlets broadcasting from China itself. And you've spent various times as a reporter and presenter. There's many different ways of presenting a story, but the information landscape has changed, and we've seen that a lot. I'm not going to call it a post-truth world or do any hashtag fake news tags to promote this episode, but in the modern social media driven information cycle, where do you see the role of the media going? And I don't mean just the social media, any hack who does his own podcast because he likes the sound of his own voice, even though I sound like a clown. But the actual media, the fourth estate, where do you see their role going?
Yeah, I think people need to recognise that the media as they have known it and grown up with it, if they're anything over the age of 30, has gone forever. There was about a 200-year period in history when the advertising, which is a big part of an economy, was attached to news gathering. When they put newspapers, where they put the advertising and the news elements together and created a new thing that hadn't existed previously. And the advertising funded journalism as an industry. And that model effectively came when new technologies arrived, like television, etc. It just essentially picked up that model and ran with it. In many cases, it was legislated that if you wanted to broadcast, you had to have a news element to it, and it was funded by advertising. Now that has gone. It has gone. Advertisers, God bless them, I love the ones who are still with TV, but they have marched off elsewhere. In print in particular, you don't pick up a paper to flick through to find the classifieds to sell a bicycle or a house. That's all going into other outfits that have no interest in running journalism. So the money that has funded journalism for 200 years, the model is broken, it is not coming back. So when we talk about the media, there's still, I think, a view out there that the media is this sort of monolithic, mighty power. But the media that you thought you knew has gone. And with it has gone essentially the centralizing impulse of media. Because when a town might have one newspaper or two newspapers, across a country like Australia, there are basically 3 free-to-air commercial newspapers, television stations. They are by nature centrist in their position because they're all chasing after the biggest market that they can. There's no point in going niche. So much as people might have despised mainstream media when it was in its pomp, and fair enough, it needs to be recognised they were centrist institutions, and they had, broadly speaking, an effect of keeping the balance of informational power in the middle. As those media descend, as they crumble, the centralising element of it has gone with them. So now anybody, from a gentleman with a podcast down to anyone screaming lunacy, can seek to find their own audience. And the mob voice, if you can put it that way, it's very democratizing, but the mob voice has risen and the centralizing elements have gone. We're seeing that as an impact on our politics. We're seeing it in terms of the public discourse, and that is changing. So we're going to live in an increasingly, we see this in the United States, I think we're feeling it here to a slightly lesser degree. We're going to go into a world now in which the discourse is much rawer. It's much more, there's much more friction by the various elements, all using their capacities to shout at each other.
One of the big things I took from that was that a gentleman with the podcast is not necessarily the same person screaming lunacy, and a lot of my listeners need to understand that.
Yeah.
So they understand I am not the lunatic.
You must try harder.
But those advertisers out there, you heard it from Hugh Riminton, stop supporting TV and come support my podcast. It may be a very loose paraphrase of what you said, but I'm going to run with it.
Good luck.
Now, getting back to a more sombre aspect of war, and not suggesting that good media coverage of conflicts we need to know about is not sombre enough, but you talk quite a bit about physical and mental stresses of war, not just on soldiers, but also on journalists working day or night to bring the story to the public. I found it quite fascinating. You experienced some of this yourself, as you mentioned in your book, and you also work with Soldier On as a director. That's Soldier On Australia, the philanthropic organisation I tend to plug every 5 words on this show. Today was a big announcement that they're Soldier On's branching out to support national security agencies as well as the Australian Defence Force, which is quite a welcome move, I think, for those people who need the support, and the community will understand better who they need to support. But the stress and risks of conflict zones are being understood better each day. That's my personal opinion, but just this morning's attendance and the type of people that came to that attendance, and the fact that the Prime Minister was making the announcement, shows that this is an important issue that the community's trying to understand better. But I'm interested in your thoughts on whether or not the community, on how well we understand and are supporting not just our military veterans, but all the members of our community who have experienced the worst that war has to offer.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because a friend of mine is Deng Adut, who is the New South Wales Australian of the Year, and a criminal lawyer in Sydney who grew up from the age of 6 being a child soldier. And he works incredibly hard because he sets his alarm at 3 o'clock in the morning and works, because after 3 o'clock in the morning his nightmares come as a consequence of the traumatic experience of having been a 6-7-year-old boy thrust into war. He was shot 3 times, I think, and very severely wounded, and saw terrible trauma as part of his so-called training as a child soldier, where he saw kids of his own age being executed for various show executions to try to straighten up the kids and let them know what's expected of them. And these are the traumatic experiences. So we do talk about soldiers. We're at Soldier On. One of the things about Soldier On is that more than 20% of the people who are, say, seeking us out for psychological support were not from ADF or ex-ADF. They were coming from other backgrounds, other agencies. And so what we've done now is to recognise that and to essentially formalise that. So AFP, the National Security Agencies, Border Force and so on, will now have Soldier On as a place that they can go to and feel entitled to go there and get that embrace from us, and to try to get whatever help, however we can try to help them. But there are a lot of people in our migrant society who come with all kinds of other baggage and trauma, and we need to recognise that this is something which is right across our community, really.
Yeah, it's. I was reading in your book about, particularly about Deng's story, and a lot of Australians are probably more aware now of his story, given the Australian of the Year award for New South Wales. He was presented, and also the portrait that won the People's Choice.
Yeah, and his book, Songs of a War Boy, which I'd recommend to anybody who wants to understand, wars in Africa of recent times, but also just there are very few arcs in history like Deng's, from where he was to where he is now. Perhaps some child survivor of the Holocaust who winds up winning the Nobel Prize or something like Elie Wiesel. But to be able to somehow survive again and again those traumas are quite remarkable. And
it's a book on my shelf, being ready to be read. And maybe next year, listeners, I'll seek and see if he's willing to talk more about that on this show. But it's important for Australians to understand, I think, about this broad cross-section of our community that has these experiences. Now, Hugh, we're up to the final question. So I bought your book. I'm probably going to coerce you into signing it later. I've plugged Soldier On. I've plugged Channel 10. This is your bill. You have to answer the final question that all guests have to ask, and it relates to the mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways possible, like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, did, so that we can continue this debate in a progressive way. So I ask each guest on this show to finish the sentence, war is. So I ask you now, Hugh, can you finish the sentence, war is?
Cool. Look, I think war is like love. it's a kind of an eternal aspect of human character, sadly. And war teaches us a great deal, possibly even more than love, about ourselves, about what human beings are. Love has its downsides, but war has downsides that are immeasurably more telling. And, you know, I wrote about war in the book. We all talk about war. I would much rather there were no more wars. So war is, it's the great error of humanity, and we would have achieved so much if we could finally say it was all over forever.
Some of us would be out of a job, but maybe we'd be happy to be out of a job. Look, Hugh, thanks very much for accepting my invitation to come have a chat today.
Great pleasure, mate.
Thank you very much for your work you're doing with Soldier on Australia as well. I think it's important for veterans to acknowledge that it's not just ourselves who help ourselves, but it's linking with the wider community and people such as yourself that have had similar experiences and can bring a lot to the party. Now, listeners, make sure you follow Hugh on Twitter. His follower count is just a little higher than mine, and he's at Hugh Riminton. That's Riminton without the G in the middle. Also support Soldier on Australia. Check out the side-by-side campaign that was launched today. I'm telling you, as someone who was there and has spoken with people like Hugh, people like John Bale, it is really, really good to see that an organisation that aims to help people is able to help more people that don't necessarily need a handout, but they just need a hand up. And also, finally, I'm going to plug Hugh's book, because that's what I do. I like to plug people's books. Minefields, get it, read it. I read it relatively quickly in the middle of doing essays for uni, so it's not that hard to read. There's some great phrases in there. There's actually quite a few I almost underlined, but I realise there might be some people who may want to borrow my copy. But don't worry, Hugh, I'll try and encourage them to buy it so you get the royalties. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got for today. So until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.